He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with money shall surely be circumcised. So my covenant shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And God said to Abram, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I shall bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you are to call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, and behold, I will have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall be the father 12 princes, and I shall make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Many of you know the name John Calvin. He said a number of profound things and said this about faith, that our faith is never perfect, that we are always in part unbelievers. What do you think about that? Do you believe Calvin is only partially true about the partially bit about faith? Do you wholeheartedly believe what Calvin said, or do you not believe it? What do you do with, if you say, I don't believe it, what do you do with the man in the Bible who says and cries out to Jesus, I believe, help thou my unbelief? What do you do with that case? How do you do yourself personally? Let's talk about you when it comes to believing the promises of salvation. Do you have some doubts and some struggles along the way? Let's talk about God's providence. It goes all right until that very difficult person moves into your life and you have trouble with them. You can't trust the Lord in the midst of that. Or let's talk about your finances. There you are, things are cruising all along, and then you have a transmission that goes out in your car. Are you trusting God, or maybe not, or maybe both? Do you find yourself in life crying out to the Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief? Is it unusual for any Christian to have faith that is sometimes weak? And is there any way out of that predicament? Is there any way forward to a weak faith? How can you make faith grow and develop and feed it? I might say you can by listening to the promises of God. Our brother Scott is doing a personal study on the promises of God, a great way to study the Bible. But there's also not only directly looking at the promises of God, but reading the Word. There you find the promises of God. And then in the preaching of the Word, there is particularly the way to feed faith, to grow that muscle of faith stronger than what it presently is. There are other means as well. We often call them means of grace. Prayer and the sacraments are ways to grow our faith. This morning, we want to begin to look at the idea of how sacraments help us in growing our faith. As we unfold before our very eyes God's gracious confirmation of his promises, first to a weak recipient. Here we find the need as we search the larger context of the life of Abraham. As you search the scriptures and go back and forth through them, you recognize that Abraham is the man of faith, the father of the faith. As you look at the New Testament, he's the most gracious and normal example of faith is Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was credited him as righteousness. You might have the assumption that that Abraham had a faith as strong as steel, that there were no weaknesses in it, no soft spots, no struggles, no cracks in his faith. You might throw out for us, for instance, think about Abraham. He left went and moved to two different countries. He was first called out of his homeland to from the Ur of the Chaldees to Haran. And then he spent some time there, and then God called him from Haran to Canaan. Imagine yourself if you went to three different countries and two new ones that the Lord would say, I want you to go there. Come follow me. Some of us are challenged by the idea of going on a 2-week mission trip to the Czech Republic. Yes, it upsets our comfort. It challenges and stretches our faith. Well, Abraham had a lot of trials and hardships. But his faith was tempered in the fire. Remember his highlights. Remember him at Mount Moriah with Isaac. He was willing to sacrifice his only son, the son of the promise, the son that he had waited so long for, the son through whom he would become a great nation, the son that would be a blessing to the nations, and the son through whom the promised serpent crusher would arrive. Abraham was willing to sacrifice that son Isaac, through whom Jesus would ultimately come from. But then there's the weak side of his faith as we go through the earlier chapters of Genesis. Genesis are there as you go through. You'll remember what he did with Pharaoh. Yes, Sarah, she's my sister. A little white lie. And went on for a while, and then Abraham was discovered. You would think that it was a one-time thing that he did it and it was all over with. But you come to chapter 20 and you find deja vu, not with Pharaoh this time, but with a king and a man named Abimelech there. And you have like a sad dream all over again of the failure of Abraham to trust the Lord. Yet you think about it in the early chapters of Genesis, he had every reason to trust the Lord. Genesis 15 is a powerful chapter that we looked at. God comes to him and declares himself as his shield and his very great reward. And then God renews in covenant his commitments from Genesis 12, 1 through 3, that Abraham will have a land, that he will have offspring like the stars. And then in Genesis 15, you have that high mountaintop experience where God says to Abraham, split some animals and lay them apart from one another, the two halves. And God passes through the halves and declares his name and says he will keep his covenant to the extent that even if God breaks his promises, what is done to those animals would be done to God. You would expect after such a retreat that Abraham would never waver in his faith with such an awesome experience that he would never doubt the Lord. But then there's the promises of God. And the promises of God start about a son, and they go on for 12 years. No son. Then Abraham decides with his wife Sarah to try plan B. He goes down to the fertility clinic, marries a woman named Hagar as a surrogate mother, and Hagar is there as a second wife of Abraham, and it works. Eureka! Ishmael is born. Now the promises of God would seem to be fulfilled. And even as God says, you're going to have a son by Sarah, what does Abraham do in our text? Well, in verse 18, he says, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Lord, this is the way to go. Here is a humanly responsible solution to the problem of no promise being fulfilled, no son. Lord, let me help you out a little bit. I know you're incapable in some areas. He wouldn't quite say that to God, but he tries to steer the Lord in a more predictable solution. Let it be Ishmael, the son of Hagar. Dale Ralph Davis said, Ishmael had been the fruit of Sarah and Abraham's deity assistance program. Don't you like that? A deity assistant program. Who would ever have the gall to suggest such a thing? Well, Abraham had the gall, but you would not yourself ever try that, to put God on your welfare program. God, I've got to help you out to fulfill your promises. And Lord, it's 13 years up to chapter 16 waiting, and then our number 12 years, and then a number of 13 years from the time that Ishmael's born to this chapter in chapter 17, and there was no fulfillment of the promise. That's 25 years of waiting for the promise of God to be fulfilled. Davis as well says, we prefer a God who is on the move, whose promises are delivered with microwave instructions. Press the button, promise fulfilled. Not 13 years, another 13 years of waiting for a son, not 25 years beyond of waiting for a promised land. Lord, give it to me right now. Lord, this is the only way it could be. And so Abraham in verse 18 offers that it would be Ishmael. Let's see how God responds to Abraham's suggestion in verse 18. No. In verse 19. But Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. God says no. And then in verses 20 and 21, he basically says why. He will prosper Ishmael, but verse 21 is the heart of it. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. That was a route that God had chosen, not through Hagar, but through Sarah, a son would be born. Why did God do this? You ask yourself, why this kind of thing? Because he wanted to make sure that the fulfillment of his promises did not depend on man's schemes or effort by man's natural resources. As if, as Abraham suggested, the Almighty needed help in fulfilling his promises. Who would have the gall to ever say that? Lord, I think this might be a way out. Abraham was taught, as the people of God are taught, to depend on the promise of God alone and God's faithful word of promise. Put yourself back in Abraham's shoes. Here's Abraham at 99 years old. There he is. And Romans 4 says his body was as good as dead, and Sarah's womb was as good as dead. Impossible. Who does this depend on? If there's going to be a son from Sarah, who does this depend on but the Lord alone? Humanly impossible. Could not be figured out. The maze could not be undone. It did not fit Abraham's plan and method. And we find ourselves in similar circumstances. We think we've figured out exactly how the Lord must fulfill this promise to us. And he doesn't do it on our timetable or our way. And he rejects our natural resources. What Abraham's left with is what we're left with, is God alone and his promise. To lay hold of him by faith and not let go, to place our stakes in God and his pledges, that there is really our hope and strength. Now, in the whole milieu of all these things happening, notice how the Lord appears to Abraham in verse 1 of chapter 17. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am the Lord Almighty. And then he talks about walking before him and be blameless and establishing his covenant. That idea of the Lord Almighty, the Hebrew terms are El Shaddai, as transliterated in English. It has the idea of God of power, God who is all-sufficient. And this appearance in the beginning of the 17th chapter is really the idea and invitation for weak Abraham and weak us to rely on God, the all-sufficient God alone. And what God does is he ties himself, as he has begun to do in 12 and 15, to the idea of covenant to encourage and strengthen our faith in our weak condition there. It's with human bankruptcy in mind. See, the key is not what God would, or what Abraham would do for God, but what God would do for Abraham. And you've been there, done that. The Lord has taken you through a different situation, difficult, that challenges your faith, and you struggle and you fight, and you come to the end of your plans and the end of your conniving, maybe the end of your resources. And God again affirms, I am El Shaddai, Lord Almighty. 13 years since the Hagar rout, and God comes with a name to promise supernatural offspring. That a name that summarizes God's power and his all-sufficiency. As Wycliffe Bible translator or commentary says, nothing is impossible with God, who is all-powerful and all-sufficient, the one who has all power and also all resources to provide what his people need. Later, he would be called Jehovah Jireh. Now, Abraham had heard the promises in chapter 12. He had heard them in chapter 15. He had God pass through the animal halves. But what comes here is God reminds him of his name El Shaddai, and us as well. And then he gives a sign and seal to strengthen his faith. In the Old Testament, it was circumcision. God comes and gives him his word. Abraham's faith was weak. It needed quickening because his own plans were to have a son any which way he could. But God says, no, it's my way. And when God appears to him in Genesis 17, the beginning, he falls on his face before God, the God of majesty and power, the God who is El Shaddai. And we fall before him as well, in dependence, in humility, in awe, in adoration, as weak people. God's gracious confirmation of his promises to a weak recipient. Secondly, this morning we're focusing in on the text itself a little bit more. We set the context in point 1. But God's gracious confirmation of his promises with a broad scope, verses 2 through 8 this morning. God takes the initiative and declares what he will do. He reaffirms the pledges he made in chapter 12 and chapter 15, and he announces that the promises will be fulfilled and accomplished. Notice that the chapter focuses on this whole idea of covenant, a relationship of union and good communion set up by God and guaranteed by his word. 12 times in the chapter, the word covenant is there. So you just think, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. 12 times, this is about covenant over and over again. The focus is primarily on what God would do. Next week, we'll talk a bit about what we should do. But notice in the chapter 2, not only the idea of covenant, but notice the I wills of the chapter. They are wonderful to see, and there's 7 of them in the chapter. It's God who's doing the promising about the activity that he will take place and do there. Don't you love that? That it's about God making covenant, and about God saying, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. Because that's the sort of thing that you can bring to the bank, because it doesn't depend on feeble Jim or feeble you, but it depends on God. Now, what you notice in the chapter, in chapter 17, is that covenant, biblical covenants between God and us, are sovereignly initiated. You know, it's not like Abraham sits down with God and says, hey, I think we should get together with a little covenant thing. I'll tell you, I'll give you 3 of these for 2 of them. What do you think, God? And no, what happens is Abraham does not sit down at the bargaining table with God. God establishes his covenant. It's sovereignly initiated. You'll notice even that there's children included in the covenant. And God doesn't ask them, do you want to be included in it? And they make no free will decision of their own at this point. It's determined solely by his divine choice. And then note that 9 times in the chapter, the words my and covenant are linked together, that they go together. In other words, that God is the owner and the source of the covenant. We come back to the idea of unilateral establishment by God, unilaterally and sovereignly initiated. Well, let's look a little bit at this covenant and what some of the promises are. And back to Davis a little bit. He uses the 3 P's to speak of these promises: people, place, and presence. People, place, and presence. Let's look at the first of them, the idea of the people or heirs. Over in verse 2, that I will make my covenant between you and me and will multiply you greatly. Here's a promise of a seed. Abraham and Sarah find nil right now. They have no son of their own. Ishmael, is sort of a son of Abraham, but not the son of the promise. And God says, here you are, no prospects. You've been down to try things year after year. It hasn't happened. And I'll tell you what, I will multiply you greatly. And the Hebrew has the idea, I will multiply you very, very. In other words, it's the idea of a superlative there, that you're going to have all kinds of descendants that will come from you. In verse 4, it talks about Abraham being the father of a multitude of nations. And you have to run down 2 streams as you look at that. Through his wives Hagar and Keturah, he becomes the father of a multitude of nations. The Midianites, chapter 25, verse 2. The Ishmaelites, chapter 25, verse 12. Edom, chapter 36, verse 31. But interesting enough, that promise is repeated to Sarah. She had nothing to do with Hagar and Keturah there, but you will find to Sarah in verse 16, it says, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will become nations, and kings of people shall come from her. The first stream comes the Midianites, the Edomites, etc., the Canaanites, whoever it would be. But here is a second stream that comes from Sarah through the son of the promised Isaac. This is a group of people that share Abraham's covenant faith. And the New Testament sees this promise fulfilled in Abraham being the father of many nations and fulfilled through Christ in Romans 4, 16 and 17, those who imitate the faith of their father Abraham, a father of a group of people from every tribe, nation, and tongue, Revelation 7. And so the first promise is the promise of people. The second promise that we'll look at is the promise of a place or a land. Note verse 8 here, and I will give you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, he says. Now imagine this, Davis points out, it's been 25 years since the promise of a son and a land. A lot of silence from God, a lot of ordinary covenant life. Even 13 years since Ishmael was born, not much happening. Davis makes the point that often we want religion on steroids, and God seldom sends fireworks. Today we live in a day when everybody wants a miracle. A dime a dozen are miracles. They're everyday occurrences. Even in biblical times, they weren't as much an everyday occurrences as some make them out to be today. The only way God works is through miracles, some see. But here you have just the grinding out of life for 25 years with few miracles happening. Even the promise of the land. God had promised it in chapter 12, verse 7. But here we are 2 decades and a half decade later and no land yet. And God promised that land to Abraham and his descendants. Notice that in verse 8, to his descendants and your offspring after you, the land of your sojourners. And then God promised it as an everlasting possession in verse 8. If you trace that through the book of Genesis, you go to 23 verse 3, 23 verse 9, 23 verse 20, 48 verse 4, 49 verse 30, 50 verse 13. God said that Canaan land is yours forever. But the mistake that many people make is they don't see that God often outdoes himself when it comes to the land. He outpromises himself. He gives you a little bit and then blows your mind by giving you a lot more. Why do I say that? Go to the New Testament, to Romans 4:13. He expands the promise to the whole earth, not merely the land of Canaan. And we know in the New Testament that when Jesus returns, there will be a new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. In other words, God was giving the land, the world, to Abraham and his descendants. And so there is the place as well as the people. The third of them, of the promises, is the presence. Notice verse 7, and I'm going to skip a few words, and we're going to go to verse 8. It says in verse 7, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant." Then it says, "This is the promise, to be a God to you and your offspring after you." Then skip down to the end of verse 8, verse 8, "And I will be their God." In other words, the greatest of the promises is that God would be the God of his people and his people would be belonging to God. As you look at Revelation 21 and 22 and the new heavens and the new earth, you find this promise fulfilled as God would be with his people and live with them in the new heavens and the new earth. This is really the Magna Carta of the Old Testament and of the Christian church, fulfilled ultimately in the new heavens and the new earth. The covenant was not just made with Abraham as an individual confessor, but this promise to be a God to you and your seed after you was made to Abraham's seed as well. Sometimes as Americans, we particularly look at the Bible the way you look at going down in a sinking ship. That, in other words, it's every man, woman, and child for themselves when the ship is sinking. You fend for yourself. But here what we note is God was working through covenant families, not just individuals there. And at the heart of that was to be your God and the God of your seed after you. In other words, the essence of it was for these people to possess God and God to possess them. That was the essence of it. And it's everlasting promise of the land, but also the covenant in verse 7, for an everlasting covenant to be a God to you and your offspring after you. It would continue forever. The covenant dealing with believers and their seed is not a temporary thing, but according to verse 7, is an eternal thing that goes on and on there. R.T. France, a New Testament scholar, says this, in a caring relationship which is as permanent as the living God who makes it, times will not exhaust it. No circumstance can change, no disaster destroy, no catastrophe can crush, no human abandonment can alter. And he goes on, when Yahweh says, I will be a God to you, you have the world. Praise God. Feel the power and assurance of that most central promise that God is saying, I give you myself. Do you realize of all the possessions in the world that you could have, we might speak of the Lord respectfully, he is our most prized possession, that God could not give us anything more deep and spiritual and better than himself, that our greatest benefit is not that house that we have or that car that we drive, but it is to be possessed of the living God and to possess the living God and have union and communion, covenant with that God. And that God takes sinners and admits them into communion with him. And he says, you shall be my people and I will be their God, verse 8. He says, you are mine, and I am yours. And he pledges a special relationship with those in the covenant. The Lord will make good on what he promises, on a great number of offspring, on a whole earth, the whole new heavens and a new earth, of a peaceful relationship with the living God, a relationship of covenant intimacy between the Lord and his people. And he gives to us foundationally in the early chapters of the Bible this unbreakable bond of friendship like God enjoyed with Abraham and Abraham enjoyed with God. But that special relationship is not just Abraham's, but it is a relationship with Abraham's children too. It comes, that promise to be as God and they to be his people comes not merely to Abraham as the individual confessor of the faith, but to his children as well. And we'll talk about that more next week. Genesis 17 shows us God's power with a confirmation of his promises. It was needed to stoke Abraham's faith. The fire was burning low. It was just the little sparks and the little embers that were there. Because, folks, be real, be right. Our faith is weak, and unless propped up on every side by every means, is suddenly altogether shaken and upset. Life in a fallen world beats us up. And we are sort of in a waiting room. And we require, while we're waiting, the clear promises of God to build, sustain, and grow faith. And God gives them in his word, and he gives them in the sacraments or the signs and seals of circumcision and baptism. And so come to his word, come to the signs and seals, and let them feed your faith. Let them grow that muscle of faith for salvation and then your faith for trials and circumstances in life. He wants to develop our confidence this morning as far as looking to him for our salvation and as far as looking to him for the struggles of everyday life. Thank God that he condescended and stooped to our weakness and gave us promises and signs of those promises. And feed on them the promises of the sovereign God. As goes the saying in advertisement, and don't leave home without them. Those are your life, those promises of God. Take God at his word. Let us pray.